The CEO of one of Canada's largest grocery chain, Empire's Michael Medline, back on Parliament Hill today, facing a grilling from MPs on food prices. The feds started off the fall with a promise for a plan to stabilize food prices by Thanksgiving, but it turned out that plan required major buy-in from corporations. So is the federal plan working? And bottom line for you, will food prices be going down anytime soon? Here to debate that, Liberal MP from British Columbia, Tlaib Noor Mohammed, Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer, and NDP finance critic Daniel Blakey. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Thank you very much for making the time for the conversation. Mr. Noor Mohammed, I'll start with you and start off on that promise that your government made just a few weeks in advance of Thanksgiving to force grocers to stabilize prices. When I asked the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, what that meant, she said very simply, it meant stop them from going up. Yet food prices are still going up, according to Stats Can, by 5% above headline inflation in October. Why should Canadians trust your government to do anything about food prices when you couldn't even fulfill that initial pledge?
So since the initial pledge was made, our government has been working hard with working with grocers, but also working hard for Canadians to ensure that grocers do understand that they have an obligation to do the right thing here. Look, it's not a regulated industry, right? And so one of the realities that we face is we have to make sure that we are putting in place the measures and also the carrot and the stick for grocers to be able to work with us and to see that there is a necessity to comply. The other part of this too, though, is we've put forward legislation in C-56 that will actually make life more affordable for Canadians, that will reduce the price of groceries and will increase competition, something that unfortunately some parties have chosen not to support and the Conservatives continue to filibuster. This is a piece of legislation that will actually do the one thing that we need in this country, which is to increase competition in the grocery sector to make sure that the folks that are responsible for these increasing prices have the one thing that they don't, which is competition, to ensure that Canadians have the thing that they need, which is choice.
But certainly that wasn't going to change. That wasn't even introduced in time for it to pass before Thanksgiving, in which it would have had a germane impact on food prices, which is what your government specifically promised you would do. If it did require more than simply directing an industry, which you're right, you can't do, why did you make the promise in the first place?
Well, there are two parts to this, right? The first is the long term, which we've talked about in C-56. But the short term, bringing the grocers together, giving them clear marching orders of what needed to be done. You have seen some.
What did they do?
But you have seen some grocers that have come to the table with plans to do this. Some have not. And as the CEO of Empire today said, I think he saw the importance in people signing on to this agreement that the grocers should be working in partnership with government to do this. Look, we can tell grocers what we would like them to do. We can't yet compel them to do it, but we do have tools within the arsenal to make them sort of.
But you haven't implemented any of those tools, to be fair. You've threatened taxation without specifying what it would be.
You do want to be able to work with industry. I mean, you do want to be able to work with industry to ensure that they do the right thing. If they choose not to do the right thing, then you have to take the next step. But you have to give them the opportunity. And thus far, look, I think all of us are quite upset. A lot of us are frustrated, and we will continue to be frustrated. We'll continue to push them to be able to act.
And I want to bring your colleagues in a second. But you said that you would force them to do the right thing by Thanksgiving. They didn't. Prices are still going up. They're not even just staying where they are. They're still going up by 5%. So what will you do to force them to comply? Has that point not already been reached?
Well, I think you're seeing from the testimony you saw at the committee today that there are some grocers that have understood and heard the message and are working hard to do what they think will get this into order. But this is not something that can be solved by government overnight. I mean, this is unfortunately not a regulated industry. And so government cannot wave a magic wand tomorrow. What government can do is to work with the industry, to put pressure on the industry, which we have been doing. And more needs to be done. There's no question about it. And we are doing things like putting C-56, which will have an immediate impact for Canadians. And it is Conservatives that refuse to let this bill even get to a vote.
So why are you refusing it to let that get to a vote?
I would like to ask my Liberal colleague, why aren't you calling the bill?
The question is, why aren't you supporting it? Why do you
support it.
Do you support the bill?
Yeah, and
you do. So have you filibustered in order to postpone it?
They haven't called it. They didn't call it today, Vassy. They didn't call it last week. They didn't call it.
So when they call, you'll support it.
Yeah,
to be clear,
we've made it very clear that we want to help bring down food prices. And what's hard for me to take is the assertion that somehow we're blocking legislation that they're not even calling. You can't block something that's not even before.
I'll let you get a response, and then I want to ask about the substance of the policy in a second.
So I just want to be clear. What Mr. Scheer is saying, that if this bill were to come to the floor of the House for a vote, they would support it. I just want to be clear that that's what Canadians.
He said you will, right?
We support it
and will you call it to the floor? Will the party call it?
I think we absolutely will.
Okay,
I mean, that's the
okay,
objective.
great. We've solved one problem here. Let's move on to the next.
Fantastic.
Because Mr. Scheer, I'll get you in a second.
The question we didn't get to is, will they let it come to a vote quickly? And how many days of debate do they need in the House?
There you go.
That's the question I'd love to have an answer
to.
If we're getting answers
Are you going to? You're the House leader. Are you going to allow for it to go to vote?
I don't know how procedurally you want me to go down.
Not that procedural. I think Canadians really want to know if this is going to help lower prices. Is any party going to impede any of it from going ahead.
Yeah, the Liberals have already put in a mechanism whereby there would only be 2 days of debate. They can call that today and tomorrow. They could have called it last week. They could have called it the week before. That is a 100% fabrication on the part of the Liberal Party.
Okay, well, we know it's going to happen now,
Right.
both parts. So let me just ask about the policy, because your party, in every release I could find about the issue of food prices, isolated the carbon price or the carbon tax as being culpable in driving up those increases. If you were to come into government and cut the carbon tax right away, how much cheaper will groceries actually be? And I ask because the outside analysis that I could find from the University of Calgary's Trevor Toome said it amounts to less than 1% of the increases we've seen at the store.
Well, I go by what Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, the man responsible for inflation in Canada, and when he was at the Finance Committee, he indicated that the carbon tax adds about 33% of the extra inflation that Canadians are experiencing.
No, he didn't say
Yes,
it
he
like
did.
that.
He said,
He
no,
said
he,
0.1,
no, no,
0.5%.
no, he said 500 basis points at committee. He said it was about 0.5% of overall inflation. Inflation's running about 3.8%, target's 2%. So when you look at that, it's roughly around that 30% mark. We know the carbon tax is adding a tremendous amount of costs on producers. I've got farmers in my riding that they have to pay the carbon tax on grain drying, incredibly expensive. In many cases, the carbon tax is more expensive than the natural gas being used to dry the grain in the first place. So when you tax the grocer, when you tax the farmer that grows the food, the trucker that transports the food, and then the retailer that sells the food, the carbon tax absolutely has a major impact.
The bulk, though, of that is 97% of it is exempt right now from the carbon tax. All the movements associated with agricultural products, for example, the most of it is, even the PBO even analyzed it, the current exemptions will save farmers up to $1.6 billion by 2030. If they add the extra 3%, that's an extra $162 million by 2030. I'm just trying to quantify, because you're trying to say if you get rid of the carbon tax, it's going to be dirt cheap at the store, and there's no math out there that substantiates that.
What we're saying is that why not start with what the government can control tomorrow morning? $1.6 billion is a lot of money. The amount of extra costs that get layered on and cascade down to the person in the grocery aisle buying the food.
But that's what they're saving. They're already exempt.
No. A lot of what farmers use to grow food is not exempt. So I just mentioned grain drying. Our leader, Pierre Poilievre, highlighted a farm nearby Ottawa that is paying $100,000 a year in carbon taxes. And by the way, that's set to go up, because it's not just about the carbon tax staying where it is. The Liberals' plan is to quadruple it. So with an ever-increasing carbon tax under this Liberal government, with the inflation that this government caused with its massive creation of money over the last few years, between inflation and the carbon tax, governments can absolutely control a lot of what's going on with food prices directly. So rather than...
They could also get rid of supply management and control it that way.
Why don't they start with that? Why doesn't the government start with the tools that they can set with a stroke of a pen tomorrow morning? Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, could come in and repeal the carbon tax or amend it or give another carve out to it, and that would directly impact on food prices. So why not start there?
It could, but not to the degree that you're trying to say that is. That's all I'm pointing out. It's something, but it's not as significant as it's not a third of all that cost.
I go by what Tiff Macklem said at committee, and I mean,
your party wanted to fire Tiff Macklem a few months ago, but I'll move on to your
blew by the 2% inflation target. Inflation's
bring in your colleague,
4% and higher for
Mr.
many
Blakey,
months.
because you're advocating for the Liberals to actually levy a tax on grocers your party says are making undue profits on the backs of Canadians. But statistics show that food and beverage retailers in Canada earned about 4.2 cents in profit per dollar in the second quarter of this year. Is that an undue profit?
Well, I think what we've seen is that as food prices continue to go up and up and up, it's not just the prices that are going up, profits are also going up, which means that
the profit margin very slightly.
Which means that companies do have more that they can put back into lowering prices, or that extra profit can be taxed and reinvested in Canadians in other ways. So for instance, a doubling of the GST rebate was something that came in handy when we started seeing some high price increases and raises in the interest rate early on in the pandemic. That's a measure that could be done again. The question is, how do you pay for it? And when we see big grocery retailers making more and more profit on the backs of Canadians who are experiencing a very difficult time, those are the kinds of ways that you can generate revenue to provide some direct relief to Canadians.
But Mr. Blakey, I have to respectfully challenge you on whether or not that's too much profit. They've gone from 3.7% on the cents on the dollar a year before to 4.2 cents. That's a profit margin of about 4%. That is undue profit. And how can you guarantee if you tax them extra that wouldn't be passed on to the consumer?
Well, as I say, I mean, I think the issue about whether it gets passed on to the consumer or not is trying to set a tone to say that if you're going to continue to make more and more profit in a time of serious strife, you're not going to be able to keep that money. So instead of thinking about trying to continually raise prices, why don't you think about how you can use some of the enormous and unprecedented profit that the industry is experiencing? And let's keep in mind that
a profit margin of 4% is enormous.
This is not an industry of 200 competitors keeping prices down.
Sure.
This is an established oligopoly that has had charges of price fixing against it in the past, like Canada Bread and others. And so this is an industry that holds a lot of power because they control a good that Canadians can't decide to do without. And it makes sense for them to carry some responsibility to the public when they
And you think a tax will force them to do that? They're not just going to charge us for it?
Money talks. And no, I think the message has to be that if they're going to just continue to charge consumers, that they're not going to get to keep that money.
Why?
And that's what's going on right now, is we're seeing grocery stores be able to keep more and more of what they charge to Canadians.
Why, Mr. Noor Mohammed, has your government threatened a tax but not attached any details to it? Is it really just an empty threat?
Well, I don't think it's an empty threat, but I think, as I said before, you have to be willing to give industry the opportunity to do the right thing. And if they choose not to, then you use the levers that are available to you. Look, I think
so how long do they have? Just for people watching who genuinely, I mean it, are watching tonight, have gone to the grocery store this weekend and been charged $400 for something they used to pay $150, because I'm sure we all have experienced it.
Yeah.
When will it be long enough for them to have done something?
I mean, I think if you look at the mood, certainly in Ottawa, like legislation we put forward, time has run out. Right? The whole purpose of this piece of legislation is to increase the ability for there to be competition in this space. Competition is going to force better behavior.
But that's not going to happen overnight. With all due respect, we're talking years, decades down the line.
What it will do is it starts to set the stage for action immediately. And what it also does, it sends a very clear message that we're serious. Look, the Conservatives will tell you that reducing the carbon tax is going to make a difference. It's actually not. We know that. We know that for a fact. And
but it won't be nothing. It would make somewhat of a difference.
It would do some, sure. But I mean, I think the issue is about a short-term, non-consequential fix to most people. If you look at the things that do make a difference, right? There was a potential for everyone in the House of Commons to support a free trade deal with the Ukraine, which would have helped to reduce food prices, not just in Canada but around the world. Conservatives voted against that. They keep taking these steps, saying, oh, you know what, it's the carbon tax. The reality is that is not having the impact that they think it is. In fact, all they are doing is continuing
to be fair, I challenged Mr. Scheer on how much of an impact. Yeah. But to say it would not have any impact, isn't that a little bit of sort of wishful thinking about what's going on? I mean, there have been a list of farmers who have testified that does increase their costs, which are transferred to consumers.
So let's use the Tiff Macklem number that all of a sudden the Conservatives seem to believe in, which is, as you said, right, 0.15%. 0.15% on your grocery bill. So let's say your grocery bill is $400. Do the math on that. What is that?
I can't. I'm a journalist.
Right. So that's
you know what?
That's a couple bucks.
I think most Canadians would look at this and think, if I can save a couple of bucks, I will.
But there are but absolutely, and we want to do everything that we can.
It's not silver bullet.
No, it's not.
But what else are you promising to do? Is my question.
Well, this is where putting pressure on the grocers to do the right thing, and you are seeing that, right? You have seen some grocers say there's a basket of staples that we are going to ensure the prices come down on. You have seen other grocers say they are going to not just put a price freeze, but roll back down. And I am not.
Those price freezes, to be clear, are allowed.
And this is not about defending the grocers, not at all. There is much more that they can and they should be doing, and we're going to keep pushing them. It's one thing to say we are going to completely make them the enemy and not work with them. It's another thing to say, oh, we're going to wave a magic wand. There has to be a path in this country.
Just really quickly, go ahead, Mr. Scheer, but I also want to ask you supported supply management when you were a leader. That could also get rid of $300 to $400 a year for Canadians in costs.
First of all, after 8 years of Justin Trudeau, food bank use is at an all-time high. I believe the number in Ontario is 80% higher today than it was before the pandemic. With inflation, with the carbon tax, those costs are going up. One of the saddest things you see now is when you're in a grocery store and you see someone pick up a roast or a cut of meat, and they look at it and they stare at it for sometimes 30, 40 seconds, and then they put it back because they can't afford it anymore. And these are families who used to never even think about it. It used to be fun for many people to go grocery shopping. It was kind of a fun activity, especially when you have several kids that come along with you and they get excited about putting treats in the cart. That's not happening anymore after 8 years of Justin Trudeau. The carbon tax is a major piece of that. His inflationary deficits, devaluing our currency is a big piece of that. And our point is, why not start there?
Do you blame all the provinces for their spending too? Because that also contributed to
We know the carbon, well, it was the federal government that turned to the Bank of Canada to have the Bank of Canada underwrite all those deficit spending, creating almost $400 billion of brand new cash out of thin air. But our point is, why not start there? These committee meetings with grocery CEOs talks about things that might happen months from now, years from now. The federal government, the Liberal government, could provide relief to Canadians tomorrow morning if they so choose.
I think
the carbon tax isn't working as an environmental measure. It is succeeding in driving up the cost of literally everything, and grocery prices are a big victim of that.
Just not to the degree I think that you're trying to say, but as I said to Mr. Mohammed, not nothing either. Mr. Blakey, last word to you.
In fact, what Mr. Macklem said at committee was that it was a one-time 0.6% reduction in the rate of inflation. And I talked to him after that committee meeting, and that the assumptions of that calculation did not include any corresponding price hikes. So we talk about, well, if you tax them more, won't grocery stores just raise their prices? Well, if you remove a consumer tax for Canadians, we've seen grocery stores and oil and gas companies and other big industries where there aren't a lot of players raise the price to pick up the slack. The market's going to charge what the market can bear, and that's why.
But they're
if
also
you're
going
just
to
looking for
transfer a tax, be it carbon or other. They're going to pass on costs to consumers. That's what happens.
They do, but they also raise their price when consumers get a break in order to eat that up. And so often when you talk about a tax reduction like a carbon tax, economists will provide some kind of insight into whether or not they think the pricing behavior of the company is going to change in the absence of that external cost to consumers. If companies see an opportunity to say, hey, we can get some of that for ourselves, they often do. And that's certainly what we've been seeing post-pandemic. I mean, you can't tell me that grocers and oil and gas companies and others
but oil and gas
haven't
companies
been going
have a very
after
different
Canadian
profit margin than
consumers.
grocers. To be clear, like it's important that we deal in facts here. 4% profit margin is very different than the profit margin an oil company has right now.
It is, but we do continue to see record profits in the grocery sector. So it's not like they're hurting and they're just passing on those costs. What we're seeing is that they continue to make more and more money as Canadians are.
I gotta go.
Struggling.
I'm sorry. I literally am 5 minutes over.
So grocers will absorb tax hikes, but not pass on tax cuts. That's the NDP position. That's a new one.
Well,
no, that's the study
that's
that he
not what
says.
I'm saying is that
Okay.
it's wrong for Conservatives to ignore the potential for price hikes when the carbon tax is lifted, particularly on things like groceries.
Okay, we don't know what's going to happen because none of these things are happening yet.
No,
I just want to, guys, I got to end
I-
this because I have to ground it in what Canadians care about, which is whether or not prices are going to decrease anytime soon. And I appreciate the discussion and the debate around that. Thank you very much to Leonor Mohammed, Andrew Scheer, and Daniel Blakey.